The morning sun cast long shadows across the private airstrip as Princess Charlotte stood near the sleek white jet, small hands clutching a worn teddy bear. At just 8 years old, she had traveled more than most adults, but something about this particular journey felt different. The air was thick with tension, and even the usually cheerful ground crew seemed subdued as they loaded luggage. Into the aircraft's cargo hold, Charlotte's governess, Miss Eleanor Pemberton, stood a few feet away. Speaking in hushed tones with the pilot, the elderly woman's face was pinched with worry, though she tried to hide it whenever she glanced toward her young charge. Charlotte pretended not to notice, instead focusing on the pattern of clouds drifting lazily across the blue sky. She had always loved flying, loved the way the world looked so small and peaceful from above, but today her stomach twisted with an unfamiliar anxiety. "Your Highness?" "It's time to board," Miss Pemberton called out, her voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that made Charlotte's unease grow stronger. The princess looked back toward the terminal building one last time, hoping to see her mother's familiar face. But Queen Catherine had been called away to an emergency meeting, leaving only a brief note of apology and promises to see Charlotte in 3 days when she returned from her visit to her grandmother's estate in Scotland. As Charlotte climbed the steep stairs leading into the jet, she noticed something odd. The usual flight attendant, Jenny, who always had candy in her pockets and told the best jokes, wasn't there. Instead, a tall woman with sharp features and cold eyes stood at the entrance, wearing a uniform that looked just slightly wrong. The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes as she ushered Charlotte inside. The interior of the jet was exactly as Charlotte remembered it, with its cream leather seats and polished wood panels. Her favorite spot was the window seat in the 3rd row, where she could watch the world pass by below. She settled in with her teddy bear, buckling her seatbelt as Miss Pemberton took the seat across the aisle. The governess immediately pulled out a stack of paperwork, her reading glasses perched on her nose. Charlotte pressed her face against the window, watching as the ground crew finished their preparations. That's when she saw him standing at attention near the terminal building. Royal Guard Marcus Whitfield, a towering figure in his formal uniform, his face weathered from years of service. Charlotte had known Marcus since she was 4 years old, when he had been assigned to her family's security detail. He had always been kind to her, sneaking her extra cookies during formal dinners and teaching her how to skip stones across the palace pond when no one was looking. But today, Marcus looked different. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by visible agitation. He was speaking urgently into his radio, his free hand gesturing emphatically. Charlotte watched as he argued with someone, his face growing redder by the moment. He kept looking toward the jet, his eyes scanning the windows as if searching for something or someone. The engines began to whir to life, their deep rumble vibrating through the aircraft's frame. Charlotte felt the familiar sensation of excitement, mixed with nervousness that always accompanied takeoff. Miss Pemberton looked up from her papers and offered a reassuring smile. But Charlotte could see the tension in the corners of her mouth. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, smooth and professional. "Good morning, Your Highness, Miss Pemberton. We're cleared for takeoff. Flight time to Aberdeen will be approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes. Weather looks clear all the way. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened." As the jet began to taxi toward the runway, Charlotte noticed Marcus breaking into a run. He was sprinting toward the aircraft, one hand waving frantically above his head, the other still clutching his radio. 2 other security personnel tried to stop him, grabbing at his arms, but he shrugged them off with surprising force for a man in his 50s. Charlotte sat up straighter, her heart beginning to pound. "Miss Pemberton," Charlotte said, her voice small. "Look, it's Marcus. Something's wrong." The governess glanced out the window dismissively. "I'm sure it's nothing, dear. Perhaps he forgot to give us something. The flight crew will handle it." But Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Marcus wasn't the type to cause a scene without good reason. She watched as he continued his desperate pursuit of the jet, his face contorted with urgency. Other security personnel had joined in trying to restrain him, but he fought them off with a determination Charlotte had never seen before. The jet picked up speed, turning onto the runway. Charlotte's window was now facing away from the terminal, and she lost sight of Marcus. The engines roared louder, preparing for takeoff. Miss Pemberton had returned to her paperwork, seemingly unconcerned. The tall flight attendant stood near the cockpit door, her posture rigid and alert in a way that struck Charlotte as odd. Then Charlotte heard it. A loud banging sound, rhythmic and desperate, coming from somewhere beneath them. At first, she thought it might be part of the aircraft's normal operations, but the sound was too irregular, too human. She looked around, trying to locate the source, her small hands gripping the armrests of her seat. "Miss Pemberton," Charlotte said again, more urgently this time. "Do you hear that?" The governess sighed and looked up, clearly irritated by the interruptions. She paused, listening. The banging continued, growing more frantic. "It's probably just cargo shifting," she said, but her voice wavered slightly. Nothing to worry about. The jet was racing down the runway now, the world outside becoming a blur. In seconds, they would be airborne. Charlotte's mind raced. Marcus's desperate run, the unfamiliar flight attendant, the strange banging sounds, something was very wrong. She thought about her mother's lessons on trusting her instincts, about how even princesses sometimes had to make difficult decisions. The nose of the aircraft began to lift, the ground falling away beneath them. This was the moment of no return. Charlotte made her decision. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, despite Miss Pemberton's shocked protest. The tall flight attendant moved toward her, but Charlotte was already heading toward the cockpit, her small voice calling out with all the authority an 8-year-old princess could muster. "Stop the plane. Something's wrong. We need to go back." The flight attendant grabbed Charlotte's arm, her grip uncomfortably tight. "Your Highness, please return to your seat. We're taking off." Charlotte tried to pull away, her fear turning into anger. "Let me go. I need to talk to the pilot." Miss Pemberton had risen from her seat, confusion and alarm written across her face. The banging sounds grew louder, more desperate, now clearly coming from the cargo hold beneath them. And then, cutting through all the noise and confusion, Charlotte heard something that made her blood run cold. A voice, muffled but unmistakable, shouting for help from inside the belly of the jet. It was a child's voice, and they were screaming. The wheels of the jet had barely left the ground when Charlotte's scream pierced through the cabin. Her cry was so sudden and so filled with genuine terror that even the stern flight attendant loosened her grip. Miss Pemberton rushed forward, her reading glasses sliding down her nose, papers scattering forgotten across the aisle. "There's someone in the cargo hold, a child. I heard them." Charlotte's words tumbled out in a panic, tears streaming down her cheeks. She had always been brave, had been taught from birth to maintain composure in all situations. But this was different. Someone was trapped below them. They were climbing higher with each passing second. The pilot's voice came over the intercom again, this time with an edge of irritation. "Please take your seats. We've reached cruising altitude shortly." Charlotte broke free from the flight attendant's grasp and ran toward the cockpit door, pounding on it with her small fists. "Please, you have to listen. Someone's down there. Someone needs help." Miss Pemberton caught up with her, torn between comforting protocol and the genuine distress in her young charge's voice. The governess had served the royal family for 30 years, and in all that time, she had never seen Princess Charlotte behave this way. The girl was known for her calm demeanor, her careful consideration before speaking. This raw emotion was completely out of character. "Your Highness," Miss Pemberton said softly, kneeling down to Charlotte's eye level. "Are you certain you heard something? The cargo hold is pressurized, but it's not meant for passengers. It would be very dangerous if someone were actually down there." "I heard them, Miss Pemberton. I swear it. And Marcus knew. That's why he was running. He was trying to stop the plane." Charlotte's voice was steady now, the initial panic giving way to determined clarity. "We have to go back." The flight attendant spoke into her radio in hushed tones, her expression unreadable. She kept her body positioned between Charlotte and the cockpit door, as if guarding it. After a moment, she turned back to them with a practiced smile that looked more like a grimace. "The captain has been informed of your concerns, Your Highness. He says there are no alerts from the cargo hold systems. Everything is functioning normally. Perhaps you heard the hydraulics or the landing gear retracting?" Charlotte shook her head vehemently. It was a voice. A child's voice. They were calling for help. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut. Miss Pemberton looked uncertain, glancing between Charlotte and the flight attendant. The banging had stopped now, which somehow made everything worse. Charlotte's imagination filled with terrible possibilities. Had the person passed out? Were they hurt? The cargo hold was cold and dark. She knew that much from watching documentaries with her father about aircraft design. Then something extraordinary happened. The radio on the flight attendant's belt crackled to life, and a voice came through, urgent and commanding. It was Marcus. "This is Royal Guard Whitfield, badge number 7-4-3-9. I am issuing a direct order on behalf of the Royal Protection Command. Turn that aircraft around immediately. We have reason to believe there is an unauthorized person in the cargo hold. This is not a drill. Turn around now." The flight attendant's face went pale. She fumbled with the radio, pressing it close to her ear as if trying to prevent others from hearing, but it was too late. Charlotte had heard every word, and it filled her with a mixture of vindication and renewed fear. She had been right. Marcus had known something was wrong. "We need to go back," Charlotte said, her voice taking on the royal authority she had heard her mother use countless times. "This is a direct order from Princess Charlotte. Turn this plane around." The flight attendant looked trapped, her eyes darting nervously. She pressed the intercom button connecting to the cockpit, speaking rapidly in a language Charlotte didn't recognize. The response was equally swift and harsh. Then the woman turned back to Charlotte and Miss Pemberton with an expression that sent chills down Charlotte's spine. "The captain says we're maintaining course. There are storms developing over the airfield we just left, and it would be unsafe to return. We'll have the authorities meet us in Aberdeen to investigate." Charlotte knew that was a lie. She had seen the weather report that morning, had watched her mother checking it twice to ensure safe travel. The skies were clear for the next 24 hours. Her father had taught her to trust her instincts. Every instinct she had was screaming that something was very wrong. Miss Pemberton must have sensed it too, because her demeanor changed. The elderly governess straightened her spine and fixed the flight attendant with a look that could freeze water. "Young lady, I have been with the royal family longer than you have been alive. When Princess Charlotte gives an order regarding safety, it is not a suggestion. Contact the captain again and inform him that we are returning to the airfield." Now, the flight attendant's hand moved to her pocket, and Charlotte saw something that made her heart stop. The outline of a weapon, small but unmistakable against the fabric of her uniform. Miss Pemberton saw it too, and her face went ashen. They were in terrible danger, Charlotte realized. This wasn't just about someone trapped in the cargo hold. This was something much worse. Before anyone could react, the aircraft suddenly banked hard to the left. Charlotte was thrown against the wall, Miss Pemberton stumbling backward into the seats. The flight attendant braced herself against the cockpit door, speaking rapidly into her radio. Through the window, Charlotte could see they were turning, descending. But were they going back to the airfield, or somewhere else entirely? The intercom crackled again, but this time it wasn't the pilot's voice. It was Marcus, and he sounded like he was running, breathing hard. "Charlotte, if you can hear me, I need you to be brave. I'm coming for you. Whatever happens, stay away from the flight crew. Trust no one but Miss Pemberton. Do you understand? Trust no one." The transmission cut off abruptly. The flight attendant lunged for the intercom panel, but the damage was done. Charlotte met Miss Pemberton's eyes, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. They were on their own, trapped. 30,000 feet in the air with people who meant them harm, and somehow Marcus knew about it. Charlotte's mind raced through everything she had learned in her security briefings. The endless drills her protection officers had insisted upon despite her protests that she would never need them. She thought about the emergency exits, the life vests under the seats, the protocols for hijacking situations. But she was just 8 years old, and this was real life, not a training exercise. The banging started again, louder this time, more desperate. Whoever was down there hadn't given up. Charlotte moved to the window and looked down. They were definitely descending, but she couldn't see the familiar landmarks near the Royal Airfield. Instead, there were vast stretches of empty countryside, rolling hills with scattered farms and no obvious landing sites. "Where are we going?" Miss Pemberton demanded, her voice shaking but determined. This is not the route back to the airfield. The flight attendant turned to face them fully now, and all pretense of professionalism was gone. Her hand rested on the weapon in her pocket, her expression cold and calculating. The captain is making an emergency landing due to a mechanical issue. You'll both need to remain seated and quiet. There's no mechanical issue, Charlotte said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. You're taking us somewhere else. This is a kidnapping. Word hung in the air, stark and terrifying. Miss Pemberton gasped, one hand flying to her mouth. The flight attendant's lip curled into something that might have been a smile under different circumstances. You're a smart little girl, Your Highness. Too smart, perhaps, as we're making an unscheduled stop. Some people are very eager to meet you, people who believe your family owes them a great deal. Now sit down, be quiet, and perhaps no one gets hurt. Charlotte's hands were shaking, but she forced herself to think clearly. Marcus knew about this. He had tried to stop the plane. He'd gotten a message to them through the radio, which meant he had access to the aircraft's communication systems, and that meant he wasn't working alone, that there were others trying to help. All she and Miss Pemberton had to do was survive long enough for help to arrive. The aircraft continued its descent, the engines whining as they changed pitch. Charlotte could feel the pressure in her ears, could see the ground getting closer. They were landing, but not at any official airfield. Through the window, she spotted what looked like an abandoned airstrip, grass growing through cracks in the concrete, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. This was it, Charlotte realized. This was where everything would either go terribly wrong or somehow work out. She thought of her mother, who would be frantic when she learned what had happened. She thought of her father, who had taught her to be brave, even when she was scared. And she thought of Marcus, even now was somehow fighting to save her. The wheels touched down with a jarring thud, the brakes screaming as the pilot fought to stop the jet on the short, deteriorating runway. Charlotte grabbed Miss Pemberton's hand and held on tight, saying a silent prayer that wherever Marcus was, he would get to them in time. The jet came to a shuddering stop at the far end of the abandoned runway, its engines still whining as they powered down. Charlotte pressed her face against the window, searching the tree line surrounding the airstrip for any sign of movement. The forest was dense and dark, even in the midday sun, offering countless hiding places for whoever had orchestrated this nightmare. Miss Pemberton's grip on Charlotte's hand had become almost painful, but Charlotte didn't pull away. The elderly governess was trembling, her face drained of color. Yet she kept her chin raised with the dignity of someone who had spent decades serving the crown. The flight attendant spoke rapidly into her radio, her eyes never leaving her to prisoners. Through the cockpit door, Charlotte could hear raised voices. The pilot was arguing with someone, his tone defensive and angry. Then the door opened, and a man emerged who Charlotte had never seen before. He wasn't in uniform, just dark casual clothes that seemed deliberately chosen to be forgettable. His face was angular and cold, with the kind of eyes that looked through people rather than at them. "Your Highness," the man said with mock formality, executing a brief, sardonic bow. "Welcome to your temporary accommodation. I apologize for the deception, but your family has proven quite difficult to negotiate with. Sometimes one must take drastic measures to be heard." Charlotte found her voice, channeling every lesson her mother had taught her about maintaining composure during difficult diplomatic situations. "My family doesn't negotiate with criminals. Whatever you want, taking me won't get it for you. You've made a terrible mistake." The man's laugh was cold and humorless. Brave words from such a small girl. "But you're wrong about one thing. We've already gotten what we wanted. The moment this plane took off with you aboard, your mother received our demands. And now that we have you safely away from prying eyes, she has exactly 4 hours to comply before things become much more unpleasant." Miss Pemberton spoke up, her voice quavering but defiant. "You won't get away with this. Royal Guard Whitfield knows something is wrong. He'll have alerted the authorities. The entire military will be searching for us." "Let them search," the man replied dismissively. "This airstrip doesn't appear on any official maps. It was decommissioned 20 years ago after a series of accidents that the government decided weren't worth investigating. By the time they find us, we'll be long gone, and the princess will be somewhere even your vaunted Royal Protection Command cannot reach. Charlotte's mind was working furiously. For hours, that's all the time they had. But the man had revealed something important. They weren't planning to stay here, which meant there would be a moment of vulnerability during the transfer. A chance to escape, or at least delay them long enough for help to arrive. The banging from the cargo hold had stopped completely now, and Charlotte felt a surge of fear for whoever was trapped down there. Had they run out of air? Were they injured? The man seemed to notice her glance downward and smiled cruelly. Ah, yes, our insurance policy. Did you know that the daughter of the head of royal security was traveling to Scotland today? Such a curious coincidence that she ended up in your cargo hold instead of her scheduled commercial flight. Her father is being quite cooperative now, I understand. He's been ordered to stand down all security protocols for the next 6 hours, or his daughter will run out of oxygen long before we land anywhere safe. Charlotte's stomach dropped. That's why Marcus had been so desperate to stop the plane. His own daughter was trapped below them, slowly suffocating. The entire plan was diabolical in its simplicity. Use one child to control the head of security, and use Charlotte to control the queen. No wonder Marcus had been fighting his own colleagues to reach the jet. Let her out, Charlotte demanded, her voice rising. She hasn't done anything wrong. She's just a child. Let her out now. The man's expression didn't change. The cargo hold will remain sealed until we've completed the transfer. If Commander Whitfield continues to behave, his daughter will be released unharmed once we're safely away. If not, well, she'll make an excellent warning about the consequences of interfering with our plans. The rear door of the aircraft began to open, the stairs extending automatically. Through the gap, Charlotte could see 2 vehicles approaching, a black van with tinted windows and a rugged SUV that looked military surplus. This was really happening. In moments, they would be taken from the jet, and any chance of rescue would vanish. Charlotte made a split-second decision. While everyone was distracted by the opening door and the approaching vehicles, she suddenly broke free from Miss Pemberton's grip and ran toward the emergency exit over the wing. Her fingers found the handle, and she pulled with all her strength. The door opened with a whoosh of air, the emergency slide beginning to deploy.
"Stop her!"
the man shouted, but Charlotte was already climbing through the opening. She had watched the safety demonstrations dozens of times, had even asked questions that the flight attendants found amusing coming from such a young royal. Now that knowledge might save her life. She jumped onto the slide, inflated surface cushioning her fall as she tumbled down. The ground rushed up to meet her, and she rolled when she hit the cracked concrete, just as she'd learned in her riding lessons when falling from a horse. Pain shot through her shoulder, but she forced herself to her feet and ran. Behind her, chaos erupted. The man was screaming orders, the flight attendant scrambling after Charlotte. Miss Pemberton's voice rang out, "Run, Charlotte, run!" The elderly governess had thrown herself at the man, her small frame no match for his strength, but buying Charlotte's precious seconds. The tree line was 50 meters away, then 40. Charlotte's legs pumped as fast as they could carry her, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear footsteps pounding behind her, getting closer. The vehicles had changed direction, racing to cut her off. She wasn't going to make it to the forest. Then she heard it. The distinctive thump of helicopter rotors, growing louder by the second. Charlotte risked a glance over her shoulder and saw 3 military helicopters cresting the hills surrounding the airstrip, moving fast and low. One was painted in the colors of the Royal Protection Command, the other to bore the insignia of the Special Air Service. The vehicles skidded to a halt, their occupants scrambling back toward cover. The man who had been chasing Charlotte stopped, his face twisting with fury and fear. He pulled a weapon from his jacket, but before he could even raise it, a sharp crack echoed across the airstrip and he fell. Clutching his leg, the lead helicopter touched down between Charlotte and her pursuers, its rotors still spinning. The door slid open, and Marcus jumped out, followed by 6 heavily armed commandos in full tactical gear. His face was a mask of controlled fury, his weapon trained on the figures near the jet. "Hey, Charlotte," he called out, his voice barely audible over the helicopter noise. "Stay where you are. But Charlotte wasn't thinking about her own safety anymore. Marcus, your daughter. She's in the cargo hold. She's running out of air. The color drained from Marcus's face. He barked orders into his radio while two of the commandos sprinted toward her, forming a protective barrier with their bodies. The other helicopters had landed now, disgorging more soldiers who were systematically securing the area. The flight attendant and pilot had their hands raised, faces down on the tarmac as they were taken into custody. Charlotte watched as Marcus ran to the jet, other commandos following. They disappeared inside, and she could hear the sound of metal being forced open, emergency equipment being deployed. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Then Marcus emerged, carrying a small figure wrapped in a thermal blanket. Even from a distance, Charlotte could see the girl was breathing. Coughing and gasping but alive, relief flooded through Charlotte so powerfully that her legs gave out. One of the commandos caught her, speaking gently. "It's all right, Your Highness. You're safe now. Your mother is on her way. You were very brave." Brave. The word felt hollow. She had been terrified every second. But she had trusted her instincts, had acted when action was needed, and had refused to give up even when things seemed hopeless. Maybe that was what bravery really was, not the absence of fear, but the choice to do the right thing despite it. Marcus was walking toward her now, his daughter clinging to him with desperate strength. The girl looked about Charlotte's age, with dark hair and her father's serious eyes. She was crying great heaving sobs of relief and residual terror. Marcus knelt down when he reached Charlotte, one arm still wrapped protectively around his daughter. "Your Highness," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. If you hadn't heard her, if you hadn't insisted something was wrong, if you hadn't been brave enough to demand we turn back—" He couldn't finish the sentence. His eyes bright with unshed tears, Charlotte looked at the girl, who was staring at her with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "What's your name?" Charlotte asked softly. "Emma," the girl whispered. "Emma Whitfield. You saved my life." Charlotte shook her head. "Your father saved both of us. And Miss Pemberton." She looked back toward the jet, where the elderly governess was being helped down the stairs, looking shaken but unharmed. "We all saved each other." More helicopters were arriving now, including one that Charlotte recognized immediately as her mother's. She could see the Queen standing in the doorway even before it touched down, her face a mixture of relief and barely controlled panic. The moment the helicopter was stable, Catherine was running toward her daughter. All royal protocol forgotten in the face of a mother's need to hold her child. Charlotte met her mother halfway, and they collided in a fierce embrace. The Queen was crying, something Charlotte had only seen once before when her grandfather died. "My darling girl," Catherine murmured into Charlotte's hair. "My brave, brilliant, impossible girl. Don't you ever scare me like that again?" Charlotte buried her face in her mother's shoulder and finally allowed herself to cry. All the fear and tension of the past hour pouring out in great shaking sobs. She was safe. Emma was safe. The nightmare was over. But as she stood there in her mother's arms, watching the commandos secure the area and take the conspirators into custody, Charlotte knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. She had faced real danger, had made life-or-death decisions, had discovered reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. She was still just 8 years old, still liked teddy bears and fairy tales, but she was also something more now. She was a survivor, and she would never forget the lesson she had learned today, that sometimes the smallest voice, if brave enough to speak up, could change everything. The royal palace had never felt more like home than it did 3 days after the kidnapping attempt. Charlotte sat in the informal drawing room where her family gathered on quiet evenings, watching the fire crackle in the massive stone fireplace. Her shoulder still ached from her tumble down the emergency slide, and she had a spectacular bruise that her younger brother George found endlessly fascinating. But she was alive, safe, and surrounded by people who loved her. Queen Catherine sat beside her daughter on the sofa, one arm draped protectively around Charlotte's shoulders. The Queen had barely let Charlotte out of her sight since the incident, canceling all official engagements to simply be present. King William stood by the window, looking out at the palace gardens, where security personnel now patrolled in greater numbers than before. His jaw was tight. His hands clasped behind his back in the way that Charlotte knew meant he was struggling with difficult emotions. "The investigation is ongoing," Commander James Harrison of Royal Security was saying, his voice grave as he briefed the family. He looked exhausted, having worked nearly non-stop since the incident. "We've identified 12 individuals involved in the conspiracy. The pilot and flight attendant have been providing information in exchange for reduced sentences. It appears this was orchestrated by a foreign intelligence service working with domestic criminals who had grievances against the crown." Charlotte listened intently, though part of her wanted to cover her ears and pretend none of it had happened. But her mother had insisted she be included in this briefing, saying that Charlotte had earned the right to understand what she had survived and why. "The demands were financial initially," Harrison continued. "They wanted the release of certain political prisoners and a substantial payment. But the real goal was humiliation, to prove that even the royal family wasn't untouchable. Taking Princess Charlotte and holding her hostage while her location was unknown would have created a crisis that could have destabilized the government." King William turned from the window, his expression hard, and Emma Whitfield was taken specifically to control Marcus. Harrison nodded grimly. They knew that if the head of the princess's protection detail discovered the plot, he would have the authority to ground the aircraft immediately. By threatening his daughter's life, they ensured his compliance. It was Marcus himself who broke protocol, who chose to alert us despite knowing it might cost Emma her life. Charlotte thought about Marcus and the impossible choice he had faced. Save his daughter by staying silent and allowing Charlotte to be kidnapped. Or save Charlotte and risk losing Emma. He had chosen to save them both by refusing to accept either option. By fighting past his colleagues and getting a warning through, even when it seemed hopeless. "Where is Marcus now?" Charlotte asked quietly. "And Emma?" "They're both safe," her mother assured her. "Marcus has been placed on administrative leave, not as punishment, but to give him time to process everything and be with Emma. The girl has been through a terrible ordeal. She was locked in that cargo hold for over an hour, in darkness and cold, running out of air. The doctors say she'll recover physically, but the psychological trauma will take time to heal." Charlotte felt a pang of guilt, though she knew intellectually that none of this was her fault. Emma had suffered because of who Charlotte was, because criminals had seen value in using children as weapons against their parents. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. And Charlotte was determined to do something about it. "I want to see them," Charlotte announced with the quiet authority she had discovered in herself during the crisis. "Emma and Marcus. I want to visit them." Her parents exchanged glances, and Charlotte could see her mother calculating the security implications, the protocol violations, the precedent it would set. But Queen Catherine was also a mother who had nearly lost her daughter, and she understood that some things were more important than protocol. "We'll arrange it," the king said firmly, making the decision for both of them. "Tomorrow, if they're willing to receive us, Emma deserves to know that what she endured wasn't in vain, that her courage and her father's sacrifice saved you both." Commander Harrison cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "There's one more matter we need to discuss, Your Majesties, Your Highness. The media has gotten wind of the incident. We've managed to keep most details classified for security reasons, but the story is breaking. You'll need to make a statement." Charlotte's stomach clenched. She had known this was coming, had seen the news helicopters circling the palace, the reporters camped outside the gates. Everyone would know now about her fear, her panic, her desperate run across that airstrip. Everyone would analyze and judge and speculate about what had happened in those terrifying minutes. "Charlotte doesn't have to say anything," Queen Catherine said sharply. "She's 8 years old. She's not going on television to relive a traumatic experience for public consumption." Charlotte was thinking about Emma, locked in darkness and running out of air while her father fought desperately to save her. She was thinking about Miss Pemberton, who had thrown herself at an armed man to buy Charlotte time to escape. She was thinking about all the people who had risked everything to bring them home safely. "I want to make a statement," Charlotte said, her voice soft but certain. Not a long one. "Just something to thank the people who saved us, and to let everyone know that we're okay." Her father knelt in front of her, his eyes searching her face. "You don't have to do this, sweetheart." You've already been so brave. You don't have to be brave for the cameras, too. Charlotte met his gaze steadily. I know I don't have to, but I want to. People are worried, and they deserve to know the truth. Besides, if I don't say something, they'll just make up stories. And the stories will probably be worse than what really happened. Her mother's laugh was surprised and a little watery. When did you get so wise? I learned from the best, Charlotte replied, squeezing her mother's hand. The next afternoon, Charlotte stood in the palace garden with her family. Facing a small group of carefully selected journalists, she had chosen to wear a simple blue dress, her favorite color, with her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked like what she was, a young girl who had survived. Something no child should have to face. The statement she had prepared with her parents' help was brief. She thanked the Royal Protection Command, the Special Air Service, and especially Royal Guard Marcus Whitfield for their quick response. She mentioned Miss Pemberton's bravery and asked for privacy for Emma Whitfield as she recovered from her ordeal. And then she added something that hadn't been in the prepared text. I've learned that being scared doesn't mean you're not brave, Charlotte said, her voice clear in the quiet garden. Being brave means doing what's right even when you're terrified. It means trusting the people who love you and who are trying to protect you. I was scared. I'm still scared sometimes when I think about what happened. But I'm also grateful for every person who refused to give up on bringing us home safely. The questions that followed were mostly gentle, the journalists understanding that they were speaking with a child. Charlotte answered a few, her parents flanking her protectively, before her mother called an end to the press conference. As they walked back into the palace, Charlotte felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had faced the cameras, had told her story on her own terms, and it was over. That evening, they visited the Whitfield home. It's a modest house in a quiet suburb where Marcus lived with his daughter. Emma answered the door with her father standing protectively behind her. She looked small and fragile, with dark circles under her eyes and a nervousness in her movements that hadn't been there before the kidnapping. But when she saw Charlotte, her face lit up with a smile that transformed her entirely. The two girls looked at each other for a moment, and then Emma stepped forward and wrapped Charlotte in a fierce hug. Emma and Charlotte exchanged contact information before they left, promising to write letters and meet again soon. Charlotte had never had a friend her own age before. Not really. Royal protocols and security concerns had always kept her isolated from normal children. But Emma understood things that no one else could, had shared an experience that bonded them in ways that transcended their different backgrounds. As the royal family drove back to the palace through the darkening evening, Charlotte leaned against her mother's shoulder and felt something settle in her chest. Peace, maybe, or acceptance. The world was dangerous. That was an undeniable truth that she could no longer ignore. Bad people existed who would do terrible things to achieve their goals. But good people existed too. People like Marcus and Emma and Miss Pemberton. People who refused to surrender to fear. Ma'am, Charlotte said softly, when I'm older, when I'm queen someday, I want to do something about children who get used as weapons. I want to make sure Emma's story and mine aren't forgotten. That we create systems to protect children from people who would hurt them to get what they want. Queen Catherine pulled her daughter closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Then that's exactly what we'll do. Together. Because that's who we are, Charlotte. We're not just survivors. We're the people who make sure others don't have to suffer what we've suffered. Charlotte nodded, feeling the weight of future responsibility settling onto her shoulders alongside the memories of what she had survived. She was 8 years old, and she had already learned more about courage, fear, and the complicated nature of heroism than most people learned in a lifetime. Years later, when historians wrote about Princess Charlotte's life, they would mark this incident as the defining moment of her childhood. The event that shaped her into the compassionate and strong leader she would eventually become. They would analyze her decisions, debate her actions, and study how a young girl's refusal to ignore a cry for help had prevented an international crisis. But Charlotte herself would remember it more simply, as the day she learned that the smallest act of bravery, the choice to listen when others couldn't hear and to act when others wouldn't move, could mean the difference between tragedy and triumph. She would remember Marcus's face when he carried Emma from that plane, Miss Pemberton throwing herself at an armed man to protect her, and her mother's tears when they were finally reunited. Most of all, she would remember Emma's voice, calling out from the darkness, and her own decision not to ignore it. Because in the end, that was what had saved them both. The courage to cry for help, and the bravery to answer that cry, no matter the cost. The jet would be thoroughly investigated and eventually returned to service with enhanced security measures. The abandoned airstrip would be demolished to prevent future misuse. The conspirators would face justice in courts that ensured they would never threaten anyone again. And two young girls would grow up knowing that they had survived something impossible. Not alone, but together with everyone who had refused to give up on bringing them home. It was over. But in many ways, it was also just the beginning.